We have a good group today. All right, this is pretty cool. Hello, everybody. I am Bill Murphy Jr. This is understandably.com. This is Understandably Live, as we like to call it. We have here today Becky Munsterer Sabky, who is the author of a great book. I love the title. If I'm judging a book by the cover, I love the notion of valedictorians at the gate. We'll talk about that in a second. Quick housekeeping. We're recording all this. We're going to put it live on, not live on YouTube. We're going to put it tape delayed on YouTube. This is probably the last time I'm going to do it this way. We're going to do something else, so we figured, but sometimes we can only move as fast as I can figure out the technical specifications. So I'm going to ask everybody if you could shut off your camera, because it's going to affect how this gets displayed afterward. What else? We have people from all over. We have a good group today. We have a lot more that asked in. And what I'm going to say is, if you want, you can suggest questions in the chat, and you can also, just as we're starting in the chat, if you want to introduce yourself, say where you're from, and also just in general. I'm kind of curious why some people are especially drawn to this topic, if it's because you or your kids are getting ready to apply to college, or if there's another reason. So I'd be happy to hear from you there. But with that long-winded introduction, Becky, thank you for coming aboard today. I appreciate you being here. And with more people, there we go. Hopefully that'll work. Welcome aboard. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Bill. I'm so excited.
All right. Can we start off? Just tell me a little bit about your background. I know you were admissions director. I believe that means an admissions director, not the admissions director at Dartmouth. But tell me a little bit about your background and what led you to write the book.
Yeah, sure. So I went to Colby College in Waterville, Maine, and during my years there, I was involved as an admissions tour guide, which made me fall in love with admissions. Afterwards, I worked at St. Lawrence University, which is a private college in upstate New York, for 2 years in admissions. Then I came to Dartmouth to get my master's in liberal studies and creative writing degree. And I worked part-time while I was at grad school reading applications for Dartmouth. And they hired me to become a full-time admissions person. And I worked my way up the ranks. I worked there for 13 years, and I was an admissions director. My title was Director of International Admissions. So I handled mostly international students. I also worked with a lot of athletes, but then I had many US states, including New Jersey, where you are right now, as part of my recruitment.
Okay.
And I wrote the book just quickly because I had just had my son. So I was out on maternity leave. And I came back after maternity leave. I read applications part-time, and I wrote a quick little op-ed that was just top of mind. And it made it to the New York Times, and it was called "Check This Box If You're a Good Person." And it was about the best recommendation I had ever read during my time at Dartmouth, which was from a high school custodian. And the piece went viral. Mm-hmm. And I was receiving so many comments from, concerned parents, families, students, of course, about the hullabaloo of the college admissions process and how to get perspective on all of this. And so when I left the admissions office and I had a second child and I became a stay-at-home mom, I worked for 4 years writing this book. So here it is.
So the book opens, like maybe not the first page, but pretty cool. So actually you started right off saying you applied to Dartmouth and didn't get in. So you might have a little bit of sympathy for the majority, the vast majority of applicants that didn't get in. But you kind of start out talking about what I think was one of your first admissions committee meetings, kind of going around the table. And it read to me like you were inclined to admit everybody. And one of the lessons was how to learn who not to admit. Can you talk a little bit what that was like?
Absolutely. A lot of people ask me, how do you make decisions, right? It's the obvious question. And I think at these highly selective institutions like Dartmouth, it's a self-selecting pool that is applying to the college, right? So the students that are applying are already of a particular academic profile. We didn't see a lot of transcripts with a lot of C's, right? It's already a self-selecting group. And so when I was in committee sitting there, it was eye-opening to, the reality of a 10% admit rate in a already incredibly talented pool. And so in that first chapter, I talk about kind of the learning curve, like how do you become admissions reader? How do you see, what looks like an application that looks different from another? And how do you kind of read to learn? And that's really what it is as a starting admissions officer. You can't just read one application and decide whether or not that person gets in or not. You need to read 100 applications to get a sense of, as I talk about in the chapter, the business of college admissions.
Right. And I mean, you talk about a 10% admit rate. That almost seems high now. What years were you at Dartmouth?
I was there, let's see, 2003, I think was my first year full-time through my son was born in the fall of 2014. So I left in, 2016. I left in the spring of 2017.
2017. Okay, so not ancient history, pretty recent, but even nevertheless, I have to look what Dartmouth was, but I assume they've seen a slashing of admin rate even in the last couple of years, which is kind of amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. The highly selective institutions now, I mean, they're 5, 6, 7%. I mean, it's insanity. It's insanity.
Yeah. And so here's a question. It's funny. I only thought of this now. Sometimes I like to, but how often do you think you got it right? You know what I mean? Like, okay, we let 3% in, we let 5% in, but how often did you get it right?
There's no answer to that because there is no right. And that's how I argue the business of admissions. There was no one student who was right for the institution. What we were doing is we were looking at a class and we were saying, okay, within this class, and every class was different, you know, every year the SATs would get stronger and, you know, the extracurriculars would get, you know, more diverse. But I make this argument, I think it was a lesson I learned, you know, admitting one student over another wasn't necessarily because one student was, you know, smarter, one student was wiser, one student was, you know, more, had more talent. It was more of, okay, this particular student looks like someone we need in this class as compared to the whole of the class. And, you know, we needed a diverse class. We needed students who were going to engage and enrich what we already had at the institution, which includes athletics, the arts, all of the majors. So I don't think, you know, getting it right, who the heck knows? Because I don't know who was right and who was wrong. I mean, sometimes we'd make decisions that I'd certainly wish we could take back because I would meet these young people on campus and maybe, you know, their ethics and morals didn't quite stand up to what maybe we wanted on campus. And of course, we were denying students who would have been great students for Dartmouth all the time because we had to deny 90% plus of them.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you some questions. I think I've heard from some parents who have kids that are about to go through the process or are, and I kind of talked to you a little bit before about my sort of, I don't know, slightly radical ideas, I suppose, of what colleges should do. But I'm going to ask you the question that the question is this, the straight question. Suppose a kid is so sure Dartmouth is the school. Dartmouth is the school. Dartmouth's the one that you've got the experience with. How does that student get into Dartmouth?
Yeah.
What does that student do to get into Dartmouth specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question.
As kind of a proxy for all Ivy Leagues and elite universities.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, number one, I think approaching this is the best way to approach this is to take back control of as much control that you can have of your application, because the truth is this is out of your hands. There is no secret algorithm. If there was, we'd all be doing it, right? There are no guarantees. If you get straight A's and you get perfect SATs, you know, I talk about in the book, there were kids with perfect SATs every year that were denied, right? It's the holistic kind of admissions process. However, as I write in the book, there are obvious things you can do to put forward your best application. And so that's the mindset I try to help students get to, is that what you want to do, this is paper. We're not meeting, you know, 20,000 people. This is a paper application. And so you want to be as thorough as possible. You obviously want to give as much information about not only your academics and your extracurriculars, but also anything that matters, including your family life, your work life. I always said, you know, for us, recommendations were very helpful because kids have very similar transcripts. You know, we see a lot of A's, we see a lot of B's, we don't see a lot of C's and D's. And when you have tons of kids with straight A's, you know, where you go to next is, okay, what are the teachers saying about this kid? And so for me, what a kid can do is, first of all, you know, change the focus from, you know, what boxes do I need to check? But instead say, okay, what am I already doing? What am I doing for the sake of high school to prepare me for college? Because God knows if you're just checking boxes and the second you get into Yale, you stop, you know, you don't keep up with your French studies. When you get to Yale and you have to take French 5, you're going to drown. So I tell students, like, think of this as high school matters. What am I already doing to best prepare myself for the future, whether it's community college, Yale, not going to college, whatever path is best for you. And then whatever you're doing, you've got to figure out in that application, how do I best present myself? And what that means to me is, for us, a lot of kids spend a ton of time on the personal statement, the big college essay, and yet the short answers questions, which nearly all colleges have, they'll ask you quick little short answers,
Sure.
sloppy little, 2 sentences, whereas they spent their whole life and probably some money with a private tutor on the big college essay. And so my thing is, be thorough, and frankly, develop relationships as best you can with your teachers, not only for the sake of getting into college, but also to prepare you for developing relationships with people, in academic mentoring settings along the way.
Got it. Can you kind of walk me through a little bit of, I don't know if there's a typical day or a typical, basically an applicant that's in the parameters and winds up on your desk and you're looking at them. How long do you look at it? How many times do you look at? How many other people look at it?
Yeah.
All that sort of.
Yeah, it differs by different colleges do it different ways. Most colleges that I have experience with, it's a multifaceted review, and there are multiple people involved. And what happens is there's usually a first reader at any institution, and that's someone who's familiar with your geographic territory. And the reason they do it that way is not because if you're from New Jersey, you're competing with everyone from New Jersey, but instead that the person, who reads New Jersey has a sense of, the schools, the opportunities. Example, for me, it was very different reading a kid from Swaziland and then reading a kid from, Spain, right? So, you're just trying to get that geographic person. And what the first reader usually does, I wouldn't spend that long on it. You're reading as you would a magazine, you're moving through it. Yeah. I'd maybe spend 10 minutes tops on an application, and you read through it and you take notes, right? You're writing down kind of what stands out to you. I write in the book that in my experience, talking to colleagues all across the country, your essay boils down to basically a sentence, if that, right? So when you think about writing your essay, you have to think, how would this boil down? Because the college admissions officer is just going to write, hey, they wrote about soccer, right? So you have to kind of think about, how would this be in shorthand? Yeah. And then usually the first person will take the notes, kind of push it in a direction of one way or not. Like, this is looking like a stronger application in the pool, or this is not looking like a stronger application in the pool. And then it would go to a second reader who would probably do a quicker read. And then usually the strongest ones end up with a dean or a director who kind of keeps an eye on kind of the top of the pool. And then the ones that are kind of looking like many others will go to either, usually another director who just kind of keeps an eye that way. So it's typically, the first person spends the most time and it moves forward. But as you would imagine, for us, you get to a point, you read every application once, and then you still have so many that are kind of in that maybe pile. And that's where the time, that's when committee happens. That's when we start crunching numbers and saying, how many do we have? How many do we have to get rid of? Do we have more females than males? How do we balance a class? Do we have our athletes? So it's really kind of creating this class out of the 20,000 applications or so that we had.
That's interesting. You, how did you gravitate towards the international and athletic applications?
I didn't. I got assigned it. Before I became the director of international admissions, I had only been out of the country probably 2 times. And next thing I knew, I was on a 3-week recruiting trip with, Yale, Duke, and Stanford through kind of Southeast Asia. So that kind of fell in my lap. And then athletics, I was not, I was a high school athlete, but I did not play any sport in college. And yet again, it was assigned to me, and I really enjoyed it because it the league itself, there was a league, the Ivy League. So it was a much more there were a lot of rules to it, which felt, in many ways, it felt more structured. So I enjoyed the structure of kind of the athletic piece to it.
I see. Okay. It's interesting. The original article you wrote was about a recommendation about kindness. Is interesting. And I suppose it is a way people can differentiate. We have a question here. Is there a difference between the quality of teacher recommendations between private and public schools?
Yeah, and it's not even private and public. It's just, teachers who have, frankly, the time and the training to do it. And I have this conversation. I have a lot of teachers in my family, and we have this conversation a lot about how teachers aren't trained to write these recommendations. They take a ton of their time that they're not paid for. And yet, I was just commenting to someone, They don't have to be flowery, long letters. Sometimes the most simple, short recommendations can give us something or confirm something that we've already seen in the application.
Mhm.
I mean, I recognize that students who are at schools maybe where their teachers are carrying, bigger class loads with more people, and they don't have the time to write tons of recommendations in the way that other more resource schools are.
Yeah.
We'd see that, we'd use that in context of reading these applications. I mean, we would know, if you were attending a school, for example, where the student to faculty ratio was very small, we would expect those recommendations to be quite strong because you should know your teacher really well.
Sure.
And yet we were more lenient elsewhere. But for me, I do a lot of teacher recommendation writing workshops now, just kind of trying to help teachers. And I tell them they don't have to be flowery or long. They just have to add something new or confirm something we've already seen in the application.
I see. God, I could ask you a million questions on recommendations. One I have, is there any, what else to call it? Like silver bullets, you know what I mean? Like known teachers at known schools that if they say Johnny or Sally or whoever is a good candidate, it's gonna mean a lot more because of the relationship they've had with you over the years.
I mean, no, I mean, there is no secret kind of silver bullet. But I will say, the challenge, and this is kind of my call to action. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because we all know that college admissions is skewed. We know that, and when I say that, I mean, resource schools are schools that will answer the phone when I'm traveling to New Jersey and I want to go visit schools and recruit students. And at other schools that have fewer resources, they don't have time nor staff to greet me and meet me. Right. And so one of the things I write about in the book, I talk about New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey. I would travel to New Jersey, and there were many schools that would call me and say, hey, we're available anytime. You can have lunch at our school. And then I would call, I can't name names, but there were some schools I would call 20 times and no one would answer the phone. And so, that exists. We know that exists. Mm-hmm. And so in the book, I kind of make the argument for, I don't think schools should be recruiting more students that are already representative in their class, because I don't understand why any of us would want a 2 or 1% admit rate, except for US News and World Report rankings, which in my opinion, we should stop paying attention to. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my little kind of call to action in the book is I think these elite schools need to stop recruiting in overrepresented populations. And I don't think we need to be visiting the same schools over and over and over again who are taking our phone calls. And I think we need to be working harder to find a way to get to the ones that don't have the staff to answer those phone calls.
Yeah. No, that's great to hear. Just a thought that I had was, I was thinking when I've been asked to write letters of recommendation, as I have a number of times, I've kind of learned over time to say, give me a draft of what you'd like me to say. It doesn't mean I'm going to just sign my name to it, but I would hate to, in the crush of things, forget about this important thing that you really want, mention that you think is going to make a difference. And I just, didn't strike me in the same way or something. Is that, but, tell me about that factor here. Some people will do that, some won't. Some teachers, I assume, would say, what are you putting words in my mouth?
Yeah. No, I think, what's funny is, before when I said that the best thing you can do if you want to get into Dartmouth or you want to get into School X or you want to get into School Y, the best thing you can do is be thorough. And for me, that means advocating for yourself. And so in the book, I talk about bringing your resume to, if you get an alumni interview, which lots of schools will offer local alumni interviews. Yeah. And I argue, absolutely bring your resume to that alumni interview, because that poor alum, this is, I shouldn't say poor alum, but it's a volunteer thing, right? Sure. And they're probably going to interview 10 kids at Starbucks. They're going to try to keep you right. They're going to keep notes, but it's super helpful if you can help them and give them a resume that says, hey, by the way, here are all the things I do. And, in our conversation, let's talk about something else. I feel the same way about teacher recommendations. I think the more you can help a teacher, and I don't think you should put words in their mouth, but I think, particularly if it's a teacher that you haven't had in a year, I don't think there's any harm in saying, hey, Mr. Finkelstein, please, remember last year in junior chemistry, I was the one that, we had an interesting conversation about X, Y, or Z, just to help the teachers, help the recommenders, anybody who's helping you get into college. I think it's helpful for you to kind of remind them, of your strengths. Why not?
Got it. I want to invite anybody who wants to ask questions. I'm actually not sure whether all the questions I have right now are marked direct message to me, so I don't know whether that means they are or I'm reading it wrong. But if you have questions you want to offer, do so in the chat. I have a couple here from other people. I wanted to ask you one funny thing, which is the New York Times article you wrote was about a student whose recommendation was from a custodian and was all about kindness. And you wrote right in it, I'll bet you I'm going to start an avalanche of people writing, asking for recommendations from custodians. I don't know if you would know, but did that happen?
I don't know, because I left the office, but you know, I've received that question before, and I think it's a really important one, because people will say to me, you know, you talk about, you know, I have the penance up here, kindness, curiosity, be a good human. And they're like, now you're telling everybody to do that. So that's going to become the new thing. And my argument is great. I mean, even I don't want it to be inauthentic, but if we can remind our kids that kindness should matter, period, not just for a college application. And if they go out of the way to learn the name of the person who's cleaning their toilets, I think there is nothing wrong with that. But I don't know. I don't know if that's going to be the new thing.
Yeah. All right. So let's ask you a little bit about the future of all this. One question I was asked a number of times in different ways is the future of the SAT, ACT standardized tests.
Yeah, great question. And as we all know, I think many of you know, this year, many colleges, I won't say most, but many colleges went test optional because of the pandemic. And I know that many of them are still, you know, going to be test optional. In my experience, you know, testing was a piece of the larger academic profile. And so for us, we kind of had the academic piece and then, you know, the personal piece. And academic would include the transcript. It would include all the academic recommendations, teacher recommendations, and it would include testing. And frankly, you know, for all of the hullabaloo and all of the conversation about testing, for me, testing was kind of the least exciting and least surprising piece of the application, because we could kind of guess based on what a student's grades were and kind of their socioeconomic background, which has been proven to kind of correlate with testing, what range their testing would be. And, you know, at Dartmouth, you know, if you had a 1550 on your SAT compared to a 1560, it didn't make that much of a difference. It was more of, does testing kind of give us another piece of academic, you know, another piece of this academic whole? And so for us, you know, the kiss of death, frankly, would be a kid who did really well on testing and had really bad grades, because it would prove to us that like they could do the vocabulary on a test, but yet they weren't getting an A in English because they weren't putting in the day-to-day work. Yeah. Whereas, you know, we'd see a lot more, you know, we'd see the opposite, which were valedictorians who maybe didn't have as good testing, but if again, we could get that confirmed by maybe a counselor or a teacher that would say, hey, this kid is the most engaged intellectual student in our school, but they're not a very good test taker, you know, we'd be all right with that rather than the vice versa, right? And so I think the future of testing will really depend on what we learn from these pandemic years. I think colleges will really take a close look at, you know, are our classes changing academically by their academic profile if we ignore testing? I also think going test optional, you know, it's an interesting, tricky thing, because test optional basically means that you're only going to submit testing if it's strong, right? Which is going to skew the averages anyway for US News and World Report. So what good is that doing? So it'll be interesting. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I do think on the whole, when families talk to me about testing, I tell them, you know what? Take it if it's available, and if you do well, send it along, you know, if it's within range. If you don't, the most important thing for all of this is to keep those grades and those, you know, your academic relationships strong, because that's what's going to prepare you more for college.
Let me ask you a timely question about grades and things like that. I've heard from so many parents and kids who the last year, especially the last year and a half, with COVID, with remote learning, just upended their academic performance, upended their lives. And a lot of them are thinking, well, what am I going to do now, right? I'm graduating maybe, but I don't have the grades. My plans are completely changed. I know you're stepped away from the day-to-day admissions, but do you have a sense from your colleagues you talk to or from the general advice, like how do you address that? You know, I was doing great. I would have been on a path. I don't know if you heard about the pandemic. It didn't get a lot of coverage. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I think colleges and universities, you know, they're in this too, right? We're all in this together, and they're trying to figure out, you know, we talked before about, you know, they haven't been able to recruit and go on the road, right? So they're trying to figure out how to still drum up all those applications without physically going out there and rah, their college.
Yeah.
They're also trying to figure out the test optional piece. They're trying to figure out how to do college tours when people can't come to their campuses. But I think for the student, I'm not so worried about the colleges. I'm sympathetic to these students who are applying after these tough years. And colleges and universities, most of their deans of admissions have said, we're all going to do the best we can with what we have. And so what I hear with that is that this more than ever is an important time to be thorough in that application. Mm-hmm. And there used to be on the common application, which is an application used by, I think it's like 300 colleges and universities now. There is a question that just says additional information. And it says, is there anything else you want us to know? And 9 times out of 10, when I would read applications, students would leave it blank because they've done all their other stuff. And I think this year, if I were a parent, or more importantly, if I was a student, I would take that additional information section and give as much information about the specifics of what has happened this year for your, with your your pandemic experience.
No, I'm going to go to other questions. I just wanted gap year. Yes, no, indifferent. What do you do? How does that land on you?
I think if you can afford it, that's the tricky thing here. Not everyone can afford a gap year. I love a gap year, and again with my international admissions, lots of students in the UK and Europe, gap years are their thing. That's what they do. I think that the gap year and the deferral of college is growing, and I think it's a good thing. I think it's great for people to kind of have a different experience for a while, some students maturing, et cetera, et cetera. The tricky thing from a logistical standpoint is some colleges will admit you and then allow you to take a gap year.
Okay.
And so many people like that because it gives them the assurance that they'll have a place to go. Right. Other colleges won't promise, most colleges won't promise that they'll allow that. So in that case, you'd have to take a gap year and then apply. And that has its pluses and minuses because you might have more to talk about in an essay, but you also might not have the relationships you did with teachers. And so I love a gap year. I think it's great for everyone, but I think it's tricky because some people can't afford to do so. And then, the college kind of assurance piece is another piece that varies by institution.
Interesting. Okay. We have some questions here. One is, you talked about what you would do as an admissions director in terms of trying to reach out to schools with less visibility. What can students from those schools do on their own?
Yes, I love this question. I went to a public high school in New Jersey that we didn't have a lot of people visiting, and I wish I knew now what I know now than what I know now.
A lot of that.
I say self-advocate a lot, and I know that's a lot to ask of our young people. It requires a lot of confidence, a lot of assurance, but I do think if you're from a school that's quote off the beaten path, and that's what I'm going to call it, okay. I think there is nothing wrong with going to go to duke.edu, and a lot of these schools will list their geographic region for their admissions people. So you could say, oh, I'm from, Alabama, the Duke person for Alabama is this person. I think reaching out to them and saying, hello, I'm here, I go to school X, and I talk about this. I give an example of a letter to use in the book. I used to love hearing from students from schools I've never heard of who would say, hey, I'm, down here in South New Jersey, and I want you to know I'm here, and to kind of tell you a little bit about my school, right? We have a nationally ranked marching band, and we have, an IB curriculum, whatever it is. But I do think, you're not at a disadvantage if you go to one of those schools. You just might be at a disadvantage for a recruiter to come to your school. And so I think what you would get out of that relationship, if someone comes to your school and talks to you in person, you can also get from sending an email, if you can find the right person from that regional territory list. I think that can be helpful.
Got it. Another good question here is, with many schools still not allowing in-person visits, this is kind of more of a, maybe it's if you get in, or maybe if you're deciding, but just, how can kids truly get an idea of the culture, and if a school is really right for them, if they can never visit it?
Absolutely. A great question. I have a family friend, I was going through this, and I keep telling him to read the online campus newspaper, particularly the op-eds, because I find that's where the juicy stuff is, right? Like that's where you find out what's what the hot topics on campus are, what the faculty, are interested in. So I am a huge proponent of reading any online newspaper, because that will give you the truth, the unedited truth about a college that you might not see on a glossy admissions page. However, I am a fan of the glossy admissions page as well, because I do think admissions is pouring money into, online tours. Like again, they want you to apply. And so they're spending money now on digital media to try to help you get a better sense of what these colleges and universities are looking for. This one might sound like a little bit of a stretch, but I also think, a lot of places, particularly urban places, have alumni chapters that you can contact. Some of those people might end up being an interviewer for you down the road. But if you're if you're in Boston and you're interested in going to, Elon, you can maybe contact someone through an alumni group, because that's a great way of kind of getting to know the college through other opinions than, that are more local. Maybe meet them for coffee, ask them some questions. But the online newspapers I'm all about. And then of course, all the obvious things, which are, the admissions online tours, looking at the actual course curriculum guides and actually figuring out what classes you would take. I think that's helpful.
Got it. Another good question here is, I'll just read it verbatim because I think it's really good, but what's your best recommendation when it comes to helping an applicant who might not communicate with clarity and impact on paper? You mentioned tutors, but I've heard that admissions officers have finely tuned radar and can very quickly sense when an outsider has coached an applicant with his or her essay.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if I would call it radar, but I would call it sleuthing when the other writing samples, as I mentioned earlier, don't match, right? That's the sign here, is that, you get the perfect essay and then every other thing is a mess. And so, but we know, like, not everyone is a Shakespearean writer. And I write in my book, like, we don't expect the great American college essay because there is no such thing. However, we do want students to spell check, to edit, and to put forward their best writing sample. But I think, there is nothing wrong with getting some free help from a teacher, from a parent, from a friend. I mean, I would feel if I mailed in an essay to a college and I didn't have at least a friend read it to just spell check it and ask them, hey, is this saying something about me that feels, less generic than the rest of the soccer team would say? And so, my advice is there's nothing wrong with having other people read your essay, right? English teachers can be a great resource for some people. However, you have to kind of keep your moral compass about, you don't want them changing your essay. But I do think there's nothing wrong with kind of asking for a second look. You would if you applied for a job, right? I'd have my husband look at my resume. So just kind of, using that moral compass, though, for not too much change, and to make sure that the application itself, you give yourself time to be thorough and edit every piece of it, and not just that big college essay.
Yeah. Are you walking around with stories that you can't even share of hundreds or thousands of utterly hilarious things that people put in their applications? I'm just guessing. Yes. I think of when I've tried to hire for jobs, and you think, what's the 73rd funniest one? I always think it's hard to ask people what's the funniest, but what's something that really caught you and said, you went through all this and you applied, and I can't believe you put this in your application.
Yeah, it's so funny you said that, because this book was much longer before legal got the legal department got involved. Because I have, this is confidentiality. I never speak of one applicant. Because I respect them all, right? This is hard. But in the book, I'll talk about one thing in the book. In the book, I give the example, and I changed the email address to make it confidential. But this one year, we were reading this applicant who was so strong in so many ways, and yet his email address was something to the effect of, like, ibreakforhotmoms@gmail.com. And I told this story when I would visit schools, because so many students would ask us, are we checking social media, right? Are we Googling them? Are we looking at them on TikTok? And the truth is, we didn't have time. I was reading, 140 applications per week. I'm trying to get through them so that I have time to go eat my dinner. However, that stuff would possibly come up, right? An alumni who's interviewing 10 people at Starbucks one day might Google you to see what you look like so he can identify you in the Starbucks, and then, oh my gosh, here's your social media profile. So I would warn students, clean all of that up, because you never know. But also, with the I Break for Hot Moms example, again, an application, a little email address could sometimes tell us as much about a student as the great American college essay, right? If you use the email address, let's use electric cars to change the future at Gmail, that's going to tell me something about you, right? And so, and of course, your first name, Rebecca Sabky at Gmail, is perfectly fine as well. But I told students, like, again, this is a paper application. This is not, we're not meeting people in person. And so you want to put your best self out there and think about, how do I get all the little angles of myself in this 120-page document? And I could tell you some other email addresses we'd see too. And we'd think, I think that kid was just self-sabotaging himself because he probably didn't want to go to Dartmouth, and maybe he was, third generation legacy, but yeah, we'd see some stuff.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I wrote a book about West Point, and an interesting thing that I hadn't realized was the sheer number of students, cadets, who were the children of other cadets. A very interesting thing was many of them talked about how, the book I wrote about was the class of 2002. So it was kind of right in the beginning of social media and internet, but basically that they could talk to their parents every day, where it used to be that they could, see them at Thanksgiving, see them at Parents' Weekend. And as a result, their parents who actually knew the rhythms and the challenges and everything, it wasn't, how was your semester? It was, did you take that exam yet? I remember when I took it 20 years ago and I got a C+ on or whatever. It's just, I probably don't see that quite so much with Dartmouth necessarily, but anyway, another good question here. Some students are afraid to take challenging courses because they're afraid to fail, get a B+. Next thing you know, you're at Fairfield University, which is where I went. Do you think that great grades with a slightly less challenging schedule or challenging schedule with 1 or 2 B+ is more valuable and more likely to be highly looked upon?
I tell students that you should be taking appropriate curriculum and learning something. And the learning something here is the most important part. And so, yes, I love this question. I sympathize with this question. I write about it in the book, because what I say is we would rather see a kid, let's use the straight A's example, just whatever, straight A's with 1 B+ in, and let's even use improv, right? Because I would see students who were afraid to take extracurriculars because they would fail. Like they got the, math, science, and social studies down, but they were afraid of taking, the music course. If you get a B+ in improv, or you get a B+ in the AP Calc 2 class instead of taking the honors calc class, we're not going to penalize you for taking a more difficult class. And what I would argue for the student is that's an opportunity to have the teacher who's giving you the lower grade write a recommendation for you saying, hey, this kid's used to getting straight A's. This kid got challenged in a way that made him grow in this class. And that's what I would love to see that. And we saw that every so often. We'd get a recommendation from the teacher who gave the lowest grade on the transcript. And I always thought to myself, that's really interesting, because it's showing that this kid wasn't afraid to go out of his comfort zone or try something even more challenging. But yet again, had the evidence of, hey, this teacher, you get 2 teacher recommendations, right? So you can have the teacher who gives you 100, go on and on about how you're the best thing since sliced bread. Right. But you could also have the teacher in the class that really challenged you, say, this didn't come naturally for this kid, but yet he rose to the challenge. And so that's my best advice, is go for it. Take something harder or out of your comfort zone. And don't forget that you do have that, I don't want to use the term safety net, but you do have that opportunity. Right. Or even comment it on yourself. I talk about this in the book. There's nothing wrong with using that additional information to say, hello, I took, Japanese 1, even though I've never taken, Japanese in my life as a senior, and I got a bad grade in it, but oh my gosh, look at how much I learned. And next year I'm going to go visit my cousin in Tokyo, whatever it is.
Right. You made me think of something, which is, this is a great conversation because you're making me think of tons of things, but at Dartmouth or any other place, do you ever go back and say, hey, let's look at the senior class and let's take a look at the people who are really successful and maybe go back and learn from their applications so we can replicate what we allowed in that time and maybe get steered away from some other things that weren't such great choices?
Yeah, I think that's a conversation happening on many college campuses. I think what's hard is, how do you define success, correct? Yeah. And so for us, one of the things, really success for us was defined as graduation rate, frankly. Like, who did we retain? And who dropped out, who couldn't do the work, or who didn't have the resources because we weren't resourced enough to give them the resource, right? Some kid who flew halfway around the world, thinking with my international hat on, right? He's never left his home, never mind his country, never mind been on a plane. And how do we help give that student the tools that he needs? And so colleges are always looking at that, right, for student retention. But I do think, colleges and universities, keep an eye on kind of how they define success. I mean, I certainly think they can use that to kind of better themselves, frankly, and figure out how they're failing students that aren't doing well at college, and vice versa. Maybe the messages that we're sending, maybe it's important to keep up those senior grades in the senior spring instead of getting into a college and then letting them slide because all you care about is that you got into school X.
Yeah, it's almost it's slang for so many different things. Second semester, senior year, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think we're going to end this. I'm going to ask you just a question. I'm doing the math here. You said your kids won't be applying to college for a while. What do you hope will be different by the time they are?
It's so funny. At the end of this book, I write that I'm so glad I wrote this book because it holds me accountable to my kids.
Yeah.
Because I see it. It's easy to talk the talk, but when it comes time to walk the walk, I mean, the pressures on our young people are real, and the questions faced by parents who are making a lot of these decisions for our young people, let's be honest, especially the youngest that they are they keep you up at night, right? And so my youngest is going to kindergarten in a month, and what I hope will change is that I do think we need to be, I think we need to better invest in our community colleges, frankly. That's a whole nother story, but I think we need to invest in our community colleges. I think we need to stop treating colleges with highly selective numbers as better places. I don't think that's true. Dartmouth is an amazing place. It opens a lot of doors. Obviously, we could talk about job security and the alumni network, but I think the world is changing. There's all this talk about Silicon Valley not ever needing college because they've got their own thing going on, and the future of kind of online learning, et cetera, et cetera. And so when my kids go to college, what I hope that they will go to a place that challenges them and allows them to have a productive future, however that may be. And we'll see.
Right. Well, Becky, thank you. The book, let's see if I can do this. I'm always going the wrong way. Valedictorians at the Gate is the name of the book. This is, all right, I did it correct both times, understandably.com. If you have no idea what this is, you've never seen this before, you should go to understandably.com and you should sign up. And thank you very much for being here. And thanks everyone for participating today. This was a really good one. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Bill, and good luck, all of you.
Okay, thank you again.